Well, good morning, everyone, and I want to tell you how delighted I am to be in your beautiful country, and how delighted I am to see many young people here because they are going to be the innovators, of the future. In our business, when we do space exploration, we basically have to innovate every day, because when you explore, you are doing things for the first time. And the only way you can do things which seem to be impossible is to continuously continue to innovate. Now, there is no magic formula, for innovation. But what we found particularly useful, in our case, are the following. Number one, don't shy away from doing impossible things. Be bold in what you are doing. Let your imagination be free, because that's how you can make advances, and how can you advance, your life and your society. The second thing which we found very important is basically to let your team, basically give them the environment to excel. And by that it means that you should accept sometimes failure, because the only way you learn is by trying things, and sometimes you fail, and failure, you learn from it. The other thing we found to be very important is to celebrate your successes, and particularly important is to capitalize on advancement in technology. So what I'm going to do today is to give you illustration of example of innovation that we have done in space exploration, and what are the lessons that we learned from them. So let me start with a very simple example. Now, people my age remember that black phone. At that time, we had no idea about that 20 years later, everybody is going to be using the cell phone. So now all of you are using basically wireless phone. Now think about how did that come about. About 30 years ago, when we started the space program, we had a major challenge to communicate with our spacecraft. And the key challenges we have is that the spacecraft were very far away, so the signal was very weak, and we had very little power. Matter of fact, the spacecraft usually run on 100 watts or 200 watts, which is the bulb that you have in your home. So we had to develop technologies which require very small devices, miniaturized activities, and developed coding, which will enable us to communicate with our spacecraft. Guess what? These are the same technologies that now you use in your cell phone. So here is an example of technology which was developed for deep space communication, that then entrepreneurs took that technology and applied it to your cell phone. That's what innovation is about. Another example, I'm sure all of you in your cell phone, you have cameras. Many of you don't know that the focal plane in that camera was actually developed for our telescopes. And then some entrepreneur took that focal plane and actually developed the cameras that you are using in your cell phone. So now let me give you another example. As I'm sure many of you have heard, that about 2 years ago we landed a rover on Mars. It's about the size of a car, the car that you have. And this required us to do a lot of advancement in technology and innovation. And I'm going to illustrate to you some of those innovations that we had to come up with. The picture you see on the screen, that actually is a rover which is now on Mars. But that was when we were still assembling it in our chamber. And this rover, all of it runs on 120 watts. That's about the bulb that you have, basically at home. So imagine this rover, now we have to package it so we can carry it on a rocket, toward Mars. So what you see here, you see the rover at the bottom, and that element which is on top of it is the descent module, which is going to carry it down to the surface of Mars. And then those two put together, we had to put them within a spacecraft and a heat shield to protect them from when they enter the atmosphere, of Mars. So let me give you an example of some of the challenges that we had to do to be able to be successful, in making that happen. First, the accuracy with which we had to land, on Mars. So after we traveled 400 million kilometers, we had to land within a circle of about 1 kilometer. To give you an idea, that's as if I go outside my office in Los Angeles and hit a golf ball toward a golf field here in Ankara, and the ball has to come straight in the cup. That's how accurate we had to launch and travel with that spacecraft. And to make it a little bit more challenging, the cup is moving, because Mars is actually moving. And we still have to develop the technologies which will enable us to land that accurately. Everybody thought this was impossible, but we worked on it, and we had some young people like the people here, which made that happen. Let me give you an illustration of another challenge that we have. When we came to Mars, we were coming at a speed of 20,000 kilometers per hour. That means it will take me about half an hour to go back from here to Los Angeles at that speed. That's a little bit faster than it took me yesterday to go from here to the hotel, the Sheraton, in the traffic of Ankara. Now, with that speed and at that energy we were coming in, that was the equivalent of 18,000 race cars going at full speed. That's how much energy there was in that spacecraft as we entered the atmosphere, of Mars. And we had 7 minutes to basically slow ourselves down so we can land softly, on the surface. So that's why we call that the 7 minutes of terror. Because we knew during those 7 minutes, hundreds and hundreds of things have to work correctly. And if one thing goes wrong, then we fail. And I'm going to show you how we do that. So the first thing we do is we use the heat shield to slow us down as we go into the atmosphere of Mars. The same way if you are driving your car, you put your hand outside of the window, that slows you down a little bit. You feel the pressure of the air on you. So that heat shield that we developed, the surface of it became as hot as the surface of the sun. And it still had to survive that entry. Then we opened a parachute at the speed, at 3 times the speed of sound. It was the largest parachute ever built at supersonic speed. When we were testing it, we had multiple failures, but from each failure we learned how to do that better. Then we had to use retro-rocket to slow us down as we get close to the surface. And finally, to land at the surface, we had 2 possibilities. One is we inflate airbags and let the spacecraft bounce, on the surface. That's how we did Spirit and Opportunity 10 years ago. And then in the case of Curiosity, what we did, we hovered over the surface and we sky craned down the rover, to the surface. So now I'm going to show you, I described to you some of the challenges. I'm going to show you exactly how it happened. So now I'm going to show you a video, which at the beginning, you will see how we tested some of those equipment. You'll have some of the engineers describing to you the challenge of that landing. And then I'm going to transpose you to the mission operation room at JPL and show you exactly what was happening the night of the landing. Now, to give you an idea about the tension that we had, we knew there were 50 million Americans watching on the internet, watching us in real time as we land. Within the 24 hours after the landing, there was 1.6 billion hits on our website worldwide, including many of them here from Turkey doing that. Now, what you will see in the video, part of it is real images, because we had a camera on the rover as we were landing, and we had a camera on a spacecraft orbiting Mars, watching the landing and watching the parachute opening. And some of the video is animation, which was basically driven by the engineering data that we were receiving, from the spacecraft. So let me start the video, and I think it's oops.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Main engine start. 0 and lift off.
When people look at it, it looks crazy. That's a very natural thing. Sometimes when we look at it, it looks crazy. It is the result of reasoned engineering thought, but it still looks crazy. From the top of the atmosphere down to the surface, it takes us 7 minutes. It takes 14 minutes or so for the signal from the spacecraft to make it to Earth. That's how far Mars is away from us. So when we first get word that we've touched the top of the atmosphere, the vehicle has been alive or dead on the surface for at least 7 minutes.
Entry, descent, and landing, also known as EDL, is referred to as the 7 minutes of terror, because we've got literally 7 minutes to get from the top of the atmosphere to the surface of Mars, going from 13,000 miles an hour to 0 in perfect sequence, perfect choreography, perfect timing, and the computer has to do it all by itself with no help from the ground. If any one thing doesn't work just right, it's game over.
Things are looking good. Coming up on entry. Vehicle reports entry interface. At this time, it will begin pressurizing the propulsion system to increase the thrust of the system. We'll use that for all the maneuvering in the atmosphere we're about to do. We are standing by for guided start of guided entry. We are beginning to feel the atmosphere as we go in here. The vehicle has just reported via tones that it has started guided entry. At this time, the vehicle is beginning to steer its way to the target. We have seen peak deceleration. It is starting its first bank reversal. It is reporting that we are seeing G's on the order of 11 to 12 Earth G's. Bank reversal 2 is starting. We are now getting telemetry from Odyssey. We should have parachute deploy around Mach 1.7. The parachute is deployed. We are decelerating. Speed chill has separated where we found the ground. We're down to 90 meters per second at an altitude of 6.5 kilometers descending. Standing by for batch off separation. We are in powered flight. We're at altitude of 1 kilometer descending. Standing by for sky green. Sky green has started.
Signal to us, you remain strong.
Touchdown confirmed. We're safe on Mars. Curiosity will take us.
thumbnail.
Today, right now, the wheels of curiosity have begun to blaze the trail for human footprints on Mars. This is an amazing achievement.
Well, today on Mars, history was made on Earth. The successful landing of Curiosity marks what is really an unprecedented technological tour de force. It will stand as an American point of pride far into the future.
Well, tonight was a great drama that was played. I could only think of the words of Teddy Roosevelt as I was sitting there. It is far better to dare mighty things even though we might fail, than to stay in a twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. So as you can thank you. So as you could imagine, we had to do literally hundreds of innovations to make this thing happen, because when we started on the project 8 years ago, many things we didn't know exactly how to do, but that didn't stop us. And I have to admit to you, we had many failures during the testing, but we learned from them. That's how we learned, to open the parachute, to make sure everything works. The other thing I want to, hopefully you noticed, is the age of the people who were in the room. They were mostly in their 20s and 30s. So for the young people here, I mean, these are the people who are the innovator, think out of the box. There were a few people like me who are, older and more experienced, but really the young people are the key drivers behind making this happen. So now let me tell you about some future innovation that we are working on now. One key challenge we have, if you recall, I told you that we had a heat shield which slows us down. So if we are on to land heavier and heavier rovers, we need bigger and bigger heat shields. But the problem are the rockets that we exist today are about 4 meters in diameter. So you cannot build a bigger heat shield. So somebody came with a simple idea and said, well, why don't we build an inflatable, heat shield? And that's what you see, in this picture in front of you. So we take the hot solid heat shield, and after we launch and go in orbit, then we inflate a big donut around it, and that doubles the size of the heat shield. Simple idea, but it enables basically to land twice as much mass, on the surface of Mars. And what you are seeing here is some of the tests that we were doing with that heat shield. So now let me show you other example of mobile, technologies that we are doing. So what you see at the left there is a way of being able to roll over a cliff. So as you can see, that little rover is actually rolling down, a little rover down a cliff, vertical cliff. Here you see a much larger walking rover, which is basically will allow us to explore, and have a human that we would send to Mars, in the future. This is a rover which goes below the ice in lakes. So it's an upside rover that we are now operating in Alaska, which allow us to examine the ice from under the surface instead of from above the surface. This is one example of what we call a gecko. And this is actually a mobile thing which can climb, on walls. All of these are different techniques of mobility that are being developed now that did not exist, for 5, years ago. And we had to try dozens and dozens of those ideas before we can come with these successful ideas. And we are going to be deploying that on our future missions, to Mars. Another nifty idea which we are working on now, many of you hear about the drones, little helicopter. So on the next mission to Mars, we are looking at actually flying a helicopter, on Mars. Now that brings its own challenge because Mars has a very thin atmosphere, 1% of the pressure on Earth. So it's about the equivalent of the pressure at the altitude of Turkish airline flies their airplanes. And to be able to actually lift a helicopter, we need to develop very miniaturized, helicopter. So the whole helicopter weighed 300 grams. So it has in it all the electronics, all the telecommunication, all the cameras, all of that in something that you can hold in your hand. So that's another example of innovative technology that we're working on. Now, let me take you to a completely different field. This is a picture taken from the Hubble telescope of a galaxy. It looks beautiful, it looks perfect. But people might remember 15 years ago when we first launched that telescope, the images looked more like what you see on your left. And the reason is, as it was being developed, the mirror being fabricated, there was an error which was made, and the mirror was not done to the right recipe. So we had to add lenses similar to what you do with your eyes. You put glasses in front of it, and that correct, for your vision. But that required literally hundreds of millions of dollars to build a new camera, launch it, replace the old camera. So we said, we're not going to do that anymore. So what new ideas can we come up with to make sure that doesn't happen? So what we have developed now is basically lenses or the mirrors where the surface of the mirror is flexible and you put actuators behind it. So after you launch it, you can adjust the actuator and you can change the surface of the mirror. So that like if you take glasses and you put little actuators embedded in your glass, and depending if you want to look far away or near or your prescription change, you just push a button and the glass will adjust, itself. So these are going to be the telescopes and the mirrors of the future, where you don't have to machine them perfectly, but after you machine them, you can adjust them electronically. Let me give you another example of innovation. There is the area of what we call imaging spectroscopy. This is basically taking pictures, but in hundreds and hundreds of different colors. That will allow you to looking at different parts of the spectrum to look what the surface is made of, what kind of vegetation, what's the stress in the vegetation, what kind of mineral are on the surface. So when we first developed this instrument that we call a spectrometer, that's how big they were. They were like more than 200 kilograms, 200 watts, and they were very cumbersome. But then somebody came with an idea and said, we have all these optics that we have inside that instrument, and the main reason for the optics is that the surface of the wave is curved, but our gratings are flat. So we had to add all kinds of lenses to adjust that curvature. Then somebody came with a nifty idea and said, well, why don't we build a grating on a curved surface, which is exactly the complement of the wavefront surface. Just that simple idea and that innovation now allows us to build this spectrometer in 3 kilograms and require only 3 watts. 2 orders of magnitude improvement because of a little idea of actually building gratings on a curved, surface. Let me give you another example of innovation which have very practical application, including here in Turkey. So one mission we are flying now is called GRACE. What that mission does, it measures very, very accurately the gravity field of the surface. The way we measure that gravity is by having 2 spacecraft following each other, and we measure the distance between them with an accuracy of fraction of a millimeter. So when the first spacecraft feels a change in the gravity, it speeds up a little bit, and then a little bit later, the second spacecraft catch up with it. So by measuring the distance between the two very accurately, we can determine the gravity field of the surface. Now you say, what's the application of it? Well, it turned out if you have a water below the surface and you are pumping it out, basically you have a little bit less mass. And therefore, we can sense that. If the snow melts in the mountain and comes and fills up the aquifer, now you get more mass because you have more water, and you can change the gravity and you can measure it. So even if you don't see it because that's water below the surface, you actually can measure it and determine how much water exists in the aquifers under an area or a country. And let me give you an example. That's how we monitor the water in the California, valley. And you can see the example at the top, how the water goes up and down depending on the season. And I don't need to tell you that water resources is one of the most critical elements or the critical resources that we have to monitor and use. And this is a technique from space which can tell you on a regular basis how much water there is in the aquifer of the Anatolian basin. And that's how we are measuring the changes in the ice in Greenland. When you hear about the ice in Greenland is melting because of global warming, that's exactly how we are measuring that, by measuring the mass of the ice by determining its gravity. So that's an innovative idea which did not exist 10 years ago. Another innovative idea is measuring using GPS to measure the ocean topography. Now you say, well, the ocean is flat. In reality, it is not flat. It actually goes up and down. And over the last 20 years, we have been actually monitoring the rise in the ocean surface. So when you hear about sea rise, it's by using a technique where in altimeter, we use GPS to determine very accurately the location of the surface, and then we measure the range from the satellite to the surface using a very accurate radar system. And by that simple concept, we actually have been monitoring that the ocean is rising at the rate about 3 millimeters per year, as you see in the graph at the top. Let me give you an example of another one, which is even more critical for Turkey and for California, and that's being able to measure the possibility of earthquakes. So the way we do it, first we take a picture with a radar instrument, then we come back the following few days after and take a second picture of that surface, and then we compare those two pictures using what we call a coherent technique, using a radar technique. And if the surface moves by a fraction of a millimeter, we actually can take a picture of that. So what you see here on the left is a picture of an earthquake which happened in California. So we took an image before the earthquake, we took an image after the earthquake, compared the two, and those fringes show you the area, how much it actually moved at a fraction of a centimeter. Recently, there was an earthquake in California, in Napa Valley, and this is a picture of actually how much displacement happened with that earthquake. Now, you would say, what's the benefit of getting the picture after the earthquake happened? Well, one first benefit is you will know how much motion occurred at each location, so you can determine very quickly where are the largest motion, which means potentially the largest destruction. The other one, we think in the future, we'll be able to image the stress of the surface along a fault, so we can determine which area has the highest stress and therefore the highest likelihood of an earthquake. So we might not be able to determine exactly when the earthquake happens, but we can say this area there is potential earthquake which will happen in the near future because we are seeing the stress on the surface. And that also applied to monitoring the edge of volcanoes, because before a volcano erupts, actually the lava moves under the surface, and you see the surface inflating a little bit, and we can determine motions of about centimeters, and we can determine if an if an eruption will actually happen in that area. And these are show you example of Etna just before an eruption and just after an eruption. And also the same technique, we are applying it now to determine how much change in the surface happen after you pump water from under the surface. So as you are pumping water or pumping oil, actually the surface subsides a little bit, and actually we can image that subsidence from space. Fraction of centimeter of subsidence that we can image from space. And let me give you one final example about innovation. Using roughly the same technique is we use what we call an interferometer, that means effectively like a stereo. So we had an instrument inside the shuttle a few years ago, and then a boom which was 100 meters long, and another instrument at the end of the boom. So it became like your eyes, having two eyes actually looking in 3 dimensions. And that enabled us basically to build 3-dimensional images. Now, let me give you an idea about the impact of this. For 400 years, we have been using what's called the Mercator technology, which was by Mercator 200 years ago, which is to basically do contours on maps so you can determine the topography. And that required literally hundreds and hundreds of people and thousands of hours of sitting down and doing contours so you can get a topography map. In this mission, in 11 hours, we mapped the whole world digitally, and now you have the topography in a digital format. In 11 days, we did the equivalent of 400 years, of work. And now when you look at these three-dimensional things, you are flying over them, that all come from that one 11-day mission that was developed. And to give you a couple of illustrations, that's Mount St. Helens in California, that's Cape Town, and to end my talk, I show you Ankara, the whole region here taken in 3 dimensions. So hopefully this talk gave you some idea about the power that innovation can bring, and not only for gaining more knowledge, but also impacting our economy, like in the cell phone and the cameras in the cell phone, and also impact our life if we will be able in the future to be able to predict earthquake or determine the amount of water resources that we can use. Again, thank you for inviting me, and enjoy the rest of your conference.